Welcome to Lecture 7, The Blowing of the Seven Trumpets, Revelation 8:1 through 9:21. This is part 1 of a two-part lecture. Introduction. The next series of the seven trumpets are interwoven into the series of the seven seals by way of an interlocking technique. The breaking of the seventh seal includes the introduction of the seven angels who hold the seven trumpets, Revelation 8:2. The next scene draws our attention back to the altar from which the cries of the slaughtered saints who died for their testimony to the Word of God. Think back to 6:9. This return to the altar reminds us of the poignant question that rang out, "Sovereign Lord, holy and true, how long will it be before you judge and avenge our blood on the inhabitants of the earth?" After the angels with the trumpets are introduced, we see another angel at the altar, having a golden censer, given a large quantity of incense. The incense burned at the altar represents the prayers of God's consecrated people. The angel casts fire from the altar down to the earth, indicating that what is about to take place is, at least partially, a response to the prayers of the saints. By overlapping the final seal vision and the first trumpet vision, John shows that the prayers and the plagues must be understood together, says Craig Kester. Their cry for justice will relate to what is about to ensue. However, the definition of justice is complicated by several factors. What is justice for the sovereign creator and covenant God of Israel? How is justice to be executed? And in light of the supreme revelation of God's action through the slaughtered yet standing lamb, how does it relate to God's redemption of the world? As we shall see, justice enacts retribution. The lex talionis, or law of retaliation, the eye for an eye principle that demands that punishment fit the crime, it will be portrayed in plentiful measure. However, this becomes quite complicated and complex when we survey the many references to divine justice and judgment as a form of handing over the sinner to the inevitable consequences of their sinful behavior. Furthermore, God is a God of life. Think back to Revelation 4:1. And so the ultimate purposes will aim toward life-giving measures. Redemption must finally include deliverance, that is, liberation of the cosmos and restoration. This is certainly borne out as we arrive at the end of the visions in Revelation 21 to 22. However, here we begin to see penultimate actions of divine judgment. This will include destructive results. That which threatens God's creation itself will be destroyed, as we are assured in the acclamation of the arrival of the time to destroy those who destroy the earth in Revelation 11:18. Justice, in the cry of the martyrs, calls for God to hold the perpetrators to account. However, as we shall see in Revelation 11:15 to 18, it means much more than this. The second part of the first grand vision cycle in the seven trumpets is a coherent tapestry, just like the first one in the seven seals. The structure matches the first part, with the 4+2 interrupted with an interlude +1 pattern. The first four trumpet scenes are a unit, with devastation affecting 1/3 of one aspect of creation, followed by two scenes of intensifying horror. These scenes are followed by an interlude, which brings perspective regarding the prophetic role of John and the two witnesses on the ensuing drama before the blowing of the seventh trumpet. The seventh trumpet brings a climactic pronouncement regarding the coming of God's kingdom. The time for judgment and recompense has arrived. And yet, the drama continues into the next great vision cycle of 12:1 through 22:5. There are two preliminary issues that need to be addressed to better understand the sensational scenes of the seven trumpets. First, we need to consider two critical traditions undergirding the scenes of judgment in the trumpets. One, creation theology and its implicit understanding of idolatry as a corrupting inversion of God's created order. And two, Exodus theology, which helps to explain the use of plagues as the judgment of God in acts of divine warfare against an idolatrous and violent empire that is opposed to the one true God. These two aspects, in turn, raise substantial questions about divine agency and divine action in the world. Here we will take notice of the further use of what has been called the divine passive, where passive voice verbs are used as a kind of pious discursive circumlocution to refer to God's activity in the world, but while withholding allegations regarding God's culpability in the effects of evil and suffering in the world. We will need to briefly consider some recent theological discussion regarding divine providence and specifically how apocalyptic discourse speaks to this issue in Revelation. This clearing of the path will prepare us to be able to consider the details of the trumpet scenes in Revelation 8 through 9. The theological keys to the septet: creation theology and Exodus theology. The scenes in the seven trumpets only become intelligible if we recognize the echoes of Israel's rich and diverse creation theology and echoes of divine power and authority expressed through devastating plagues in the Exodus narrative. It is common to observe connections between the judgments of the trumpets in Revelation 8 through 9 and the Exodus plagues, whereby Yahweh executed divine warfare against Pharaoh's Egypt and the Egyptian pantheon, who were enslaving the people of Israel. See the book of Exodus, chapters 7 through 12. The correspondences between the sequence and the details of the Exodus plagues is closer to the scenes of the seven bowls of wrath in Revelation 16, 1 through 21. Therefore, we will make broad observations here about the general theological implications of the Exodus plagues, and then make specific observations when we observe that text of Revelation 16. The topic of creational theology has received less attention. However, this latter topos illuminates more about the sequence and order of Revelation's trumpet scenes, especially of the first four trumpets. More than this, there is an insidious parasitic side to Israel's creation theology, which can be set forth in the following propositions, which will be explored more fully below. 1. Humanity is made in the image of God. See Genesis 1, 26 to 28. And therefore, humanity is commissioned to be God's representative co-regent over creation. See Genesis 1:26 and 28 through 30. Then, thirdly, when humanity reverses direction and directs worship to the creation rather than to the Creator, humanity thus corrupts the divine creation order. Idolatry is then the reversal of the creation order, humanity worshiping creation as if it were God, rather than ruling over and representing God to the creation. Secondly, idolatry can thus be dramatically and poetically represented as the retrogressive dissolution of creation back to its original chaotic uncreation. Think of Genesis 1:2, where there's the language of formless and void, and the image of the flood in Genesis 6 as the reversal of creation. We will examine first the Exodus theology, and then we will consider creation theology and its idolatrous obverse. Exodus and the theology of judgment in the plagues. As noted above, there are closer correspondences between the Exodus plagues and the plagues that come in Revelation when the seven bowls of wrath are poured out on the earth in Revelation 16, 1 through 21. This observation is complicated by several representations of the plague tradition throughout the scriptures of Israel and later Second Temple Jewish text. In Exodus, there are 10 plagues that assault Egypt. See Exodus 7 through 12, and the same is passed in Jubilees and the life of Adam and Eve and Philo, and so on. However, other attestations to the tradition have various forms. In Psalm 78, there are 7 plagues listed, also the same in Amos 4. In Psalm 105, there are 8. In the Wisdom of Solomon, chapters 11 through 19, there are 7 contrasts between Israel and Egypt that incorporate elements from 6 plagues. David Owney comments, "It is true, of course, that the plagues are not enumerated in Exodus, thus leaving open the possibility for a certain degree of imprecision and vagueness. There was a strong tendency to reduce the 10-plague tradition of Exodus to a 7-plague schema." Not many texts interpret the plagues eschatologically. The primary reference is to the historical event associated with the Exodus. However, one apocalyptic text does express a strong typological anticipation of the plagues as eschatological judgment, executed primarily as a punitive measure. This text is the Apocalypse of Abraham, dated somewhere between the year 70 to 150 of the Common Era, and it reads, Before the age of justice starts to grow, my judgment will come upon the heathen who have acted upon all earthly creation 10 plagues through evil and disease and the groaning of the bitterness of their souls. Such I will bring upon the generations of those who are on it, out of anger and corruption of their creation, with which they provoke me. And then from your seed will be left the righteous men in their number, protected by me, who strive in the glory of my name toward the place prepared beforehand for them. And they will live, being affirmed by the sacrifices and gifts of justice and truth and the age of justice. And they will rejoice forever in me, and they will destroy those who have destroyed them. They will rebuke those who have rebuked them through their mockery, and they will spit in their faces. Those rebuked by me, when they are to see me rejoicing with my people, for those who rejoice and receive and truly return to me. General representation of eschatological plagues being associated with the time of great tribulation is represented in 1 Enoch chapter 91, which serves as a bridge from the animal apocalypse in chapters 83 through 90 and the Epistle of Enoch in chapters 92 to 105. The relevant passage reads, "For I know that a state of violence will grow strong upon the earth, and a great scourge will be consummated upon the earth. Indeed, all iniquity will be consummated, but it will be cut off from its roots, and its whole structure will vanish. And again, iniquity will be consummated upon the earth, and all the deeds of iniquity and violence and sin will prevail again. And when sin and iniquity and blasphemy and violence increase in every deed, and perversity and sin and uncleanness increase, a great scourge will come from heaven upon all these to execute judgment upon the earth. And in those days violence will be cut off from its roots, and the roots of iniquity together with deceit, and they will be destroyed from under heaven. And all the idols of the nations will be given up, and the towers will be burned with fire, and they will be removed from the earth, and they will be cast into the fiery judgment, and they will be destroyed in fierce eternal judgment." That's 1 Enoch 91, verses 5 through 9. First, it will be useful to provide a chart demonstrating the lists of plagues in Revelation, both in chapters 8 through 9 and 16, and the plagues in the Exodus. So here, with these 3 columns, we can see plagues 1 through 7 of Revelation 8:1 through 19 or 11:19, and then in the 7 bowls, which show up in Revelation 15:1 to 16:21, mainly in chapter 16, and then the plagues of the Exodus. That's Exodus chapter 7 through 13. You might want to click pause here and observe what you see in terms of the similarities and differences. Thus, we can see that there are only limited correspondences between the plagues of Egypt and the devastations on the earth from especially the first 5 trumpets in Revelation 8 through 9. Notice these correspondences. In the first trumpet, there's fire and hail that corresponds to the 7th plague of the Exodus with lightning and hail. In the second trumpet, the sea becomes blood. That correlates to the Nile becoming blood, the first plague. There's no correlation between the third trumpet, where wormwood poisons the waters. In the fourth trumpet, a third of the lights go dark. That's roughly similar to the 9th plague, when there's darkness over Egypt for 3 days. Finally, in the 5th trumpet, we're going to see demonic locusts, and that is similar to the 8th plague, where there are locusts in Egypt. Therefore, the main contribution of the Exodus plagues comes not in the sequence or structure, but rather in the broader theological implications of the plagues as judgments. First, we can recognize that the plagues were a form of divine warfare, assaulting not just the slave-owning Pharaoh and the unjust social order built on the backs of the Hebrew slaves, but also on the hierarchical order of the Egyptian gods, as it was manifest in the rule of Pharaoh's regime. Secondly, We can observe that the plagues represent an expression of the divine mandate of God's creational order. That is, the plagues were part of a sin-consequence schema built into the order of God's creation. The violation of the divine order brings the corresponding retribution. Exodus and the divine warrior, the plagues as holy war. The Exodus deliverance of Israel from the house of slavery in Egypt is portrayed in terms of the holy war tradition. God has defeated the gods of Egypt and their vice-regent, the Pharaoh. This becomes explicit in the Song of Moses and the Israelites in Exodus 15. It reads, "I will sing to the Lord, for he has triumphed gloriously. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and my might, and he has become my salvation. This is my God, and I will praise him, my father's God, and I will exalt him. The Lord is a warrior. The Lord is his name. Pharaoh's chariots and his army he cast into the sea. His picked officers were sunk in the Red Sea. The floods covered them. They went down into the depths like a stone. Your right hand, O Lord, glorious in power. Your right hand, O Lord, shattered the enemy. In the greatness of your majesty, you overthrew your adversaries. You sent out your fury. It consumed them like stubble. At the blast of your nostrils, the waters piled up. The floods stood up in a heap, and the deeps congealed in the heart of the sea. The enemy said, I will pursue, I will overtake, I will divide the spoil. My desire shall have its fill of them. I will draw my sword, and my hand shall destroy them. You blew your wind, the sea covered them. They sank like lead in the mighty waters. Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, majestic in holiness, awesome in splendor, doing wonders? You stretched out your right hand, the earth swallowed them. In your steadfast love you led the people whom you redeemed. You guided them by your strength to your holy abode. Sometimes there is an attempt to correlate each of the plagues of Egypt with one of the gods or powers of the Egyptian pantheon. However, this proposal has proved unpersuasive and has not gained wide acceptance. It is better to understand the background as the divine warrior tradition, as it is more broadly attested throughout the ancient Near East. Beale sees the broader tradition of the holy war in the scriptures of Israel as a fundamental background for Revelation's trumpet scenes as portraying divine judgment. He writes, in the Old Testament, trumpets also announced an alarm that holy battle was to be engaged against Israel's enemy or against Israel as God's enemy. The primary background here is the story of the fall of Jericho, where trumpets announced the impending victory in a holy war. God typically fought Israel's holy wars from heaven by causing the elements of nature, inclement weather, etc., to thwart the enemy. He defeated the Egyptians through the 10 plagues and then the miracle at the Red Sea. Likewise, the sun, the moon, and hail were employed to defeat the Amorites. The stars fought from heaven against the Canaanites, causing them to be defeated through a flood. Some of the descriptions of victory in holy war are literal, as in Exodus 7 through 15, others figurative, as in Psalm 18, and still others a mixture of the two, as in Judges 5. Most are figurative. Against this background, the portrayal of the trumpet plagues in Revelation 8 through 9 with the same Old Testament imagery enhances further the notion that the trumpets depict God conducting holy war. Beale is more easily convinced than am I that the devastations associated with the trumpets are simply presenting divine punishment on the wicked, and only secondarily, if at all, proffering allowance for repentance. We will consider Beale's proposal further below. However, we can agree that Revelation is employing the imagery of Exodus partly as signifying the divine warrior bringing judgment upon an idolatrous and violent empire that stands in opposition to God's purposes, and ultimately will not be able to stand in the wake of God's righteous judgment. The destroyers of the earth will themselves be destroyed, 11:18, and God will finally establish victory over the forces of death and chaos. As the one who sits on the throne, God defeats all enemies and thereby establishes a kingdom of peace and justice. It is so when confronting Egypt. As Goldingay quips, in winning the victory over Pharaoh, Yahweh thus acts as king, one who will indeed reign forever and ever. Exodus 15:18. So it is with the defeat of the beast and Babylon. Thus, deliverance of God's chosen people is the flip side of rendering judgment upon those who have oppressed and abused them. This resonates with the cries of the martyrs that we hear in Revelation 6:9 and are reminded of again in chapter 8, verses 3 through 5. In this light, the plagues of the trumpets constitute divine judgment upon the earth as an act of holy war against the evil empire and those who embrace the behaviors of idolatry, violence, and exploitation. See Revelation 9, verses 20 to 21. Exodus and creational theology. Plagues as ecological signs of historical disaster. The theological reflections of Terence Fretheim on the creational background and implications of the Exodus plagues in Egypt seem as though they were written in preparation for a discussion of the plague judgments in Revelation. They weren't, of course, which makes their contribution to our theological reflections on Revelation all the more compelling. We will hear Fretheim at length. He writes, "The most basic perspective within which the plagues are to be understood is a theology of creation. A breach of these laws of society was a breach of the order of creation and had dire consequences in all aspects of the world order, not least the sphere of nature, threatening life with chaos. There is thus a symbiotic relationship of ethical order and cosmic order. Seen against this background, Pharaoh's oppressive anti-life measures against Israel are anti-creational, striking at the point where God was beginning to fulfill the creational promise of fruitfulness in Israel. Egypt is an embodiment of the forces of chaos, threatening a return of the entire cosmos to its pre-creation state. The plagues may thus be viewed as the effect of Pharaoh's anti-creational sins upon the cosmic order writ large. What God does in redemption is in the service of these endangered divine goals in and for the creation. For example, the hymnic celebration of that redemptive acts in Exodus 15 is permeated with creation talk, evident in its vocabulary, structure, and theme. It is the Creator God who redeems Israel from Egypt. A creation theology provides the cosmic purpose behind God's redemptive activity on Israel's behalf. While the liberation of Israel is the focus of God's activity in Exodus, it is not the ultimate purpose. The deliverance of Israel is ultimately for the sake of all creation. See Exodus 9:16, where God says to Israel, "But this is why I have let you live, to show you my power and to make my name resound through all the earth." The issue for God is, finally, not that God's name be known in Israel, but that it be declared to the entire earth. God's purpose in these events is creation-wide. What is at stake is God's mission for the world. For as Exodus 9:29 and 19:5 put it, all the earth is God's. God's redemptive activity on behalf of Israel is not an end in and of itself. It stands in the service of the entire creation. The divine calling to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation appears with the context of that phrase, "The whole earth is God's," in 19:5. Israel is called to a commission on behalf of God's earth. Hence, the public character of the events is an important theme throughout the Exodus story. God's redemptive activity is set in terms of a creational need. If Pharaoh succeeds in his anti-life purposes at that point at which God has begun to actualize the promise of creation, that is in Exodus chapter 1, verses 7 through 14, when Pharaoh is killing all the babies, then God's purposes in creation are subverted, and God's creational mission will not be able to be realized. God's work in redemption, climaxing in Israel's crossing of the sea on dry land, constitutes God's efforts at recreation, returning creation to a point where God's mission can once again be taken up. God's redemptive activity is cosmic in its effects. Generally, the Lord of heaven and earth is active throughout the Exodus, from the acts of blessing to the use of non-human creation in the plagues, the sea crossing, the wilderness wanderings, and the Sinai theophany. More specifically, Exodus 5 confesses that God's victory at sea is not simply a local or historical phenomenon, but a cosmic one. God's defeat of the powers of historical chaos not only results in Israel's liberation, but also brings about the reign of God over the entire cosmos. God's calling of Israel is given creation-wide scope. The theme, all the earth is God's, is picked up again in chapter 19, verses 4 through 6. A divine invitation to Israel to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Israel is called out from among the nations and commissioned to a task on behalf of God's earth. The redemptive deeds of God are not an end in and of themselves. The experience of those events propels the people out into various creational spheres of life. Redemption is for the purpose of creation, a new life within the larger creation, and finally, a new heaven and a new earth. Fretheim argues that the plagues function as ecological signs of historical disaster. He explains, as signs or portents, the intent of the plague is not finally to leave observers with mouths open in amazement. Rather, having gotten the reader's attention, they point beyond themselves toward a disastrous future while carrying a certain force in their own terms. They are both acts of judgment in themselves and point forward to a future of judgment, either Passover or sea crossing or both, and each plague must be examined in these terms. Generally, it may be said that the plagues are ecological signs of historical disaster. Fretheim draws on a seminal article by H. Schmid, which argues that broadly in the ancient Near East, and particularly in Israel, the just ordering of society, reflected in its laws, was brought into close relationship with the sphere of creation. We can summarize briefly the insights of Schmid. First, he claims in the ancient Near East, creation faith did not deal only, or indeed not even primarily, with the origin of the world. Rather, it was concerned above all with the present world and the natural environment of humanity now. This point has been strengthened and explored in more detail by the wonderfully insightful work of John Walton, especially as it relates to Genesis chapter 1. Walton's insights can be summarized in these words. He writes, in the ancient world, something came into existence when it was separated out as a distinct entity, given a function, and given a name. To describe creation is to describe the establishment of the functioning cosmos, not the origins of the material structure or substance of the cosmos. The pre-cosmic condition was not lacking in that which was material. It was lacking in differentiation, that is, being distinct. Thus, the ancient Near Eastern creation accounts regularly begin with a pre-cosmic, unordered, non-functional world. Creation then takes place by giving things order, function, and purpose, which is synonymous with giving them existence. Once established, the order that exists in the cosmos is constantly threatened with being undone. As a result, creation is not restricted to a one-time event. If we desire to see the greatest work of the Creator, it is not to be found in the materials that He brought together. It is that He brought them together in such a way that they work. Cosmic creation in the ancient world was not viewed primarily as a process by which matter was brought into being, but as a process by which functions, roles, orders, jurisdiction, organization, and stability were established. This defines creation in the ancient world and in turn demonstrates that ontology was focused on something's functional status rather than its material status. Turning our attention back to Schmid, His second observation is that the order established through creation and newly constituted every year at the annual ritual of the New Year's festival is not only the renewal of nature, it is just as much the order of the state. Closely tied is the third point. He writes, legal order belongs to the order of creation. The law enacts the establishment of the order of creation, seen in its juristic aspect. In short, ancient Near Eastern cosmic, political, and social order find their unity under the concept of creation. Law, nature, and politics are only aspects of one comprehensive order of creation. With this background, we return now to Fretheim's insights about the theological implications of the Exodus tradition. He writes, the plagues are fundamentally concerned with the natural order. Each plague has to do with various non-human phenomena. First, a word about those elements of the non-human order that are on the victimizing side. They are all out of kilter with their created way of being. Move down the list. Water, frogs, dust and gnats, flies, cattle epidemic, ashes and boils, weather phenomena, locusts and darkness. None of them appear as they were created by God to be. They all appear in distorted form. Water is no longer simply water. Light and darkness are no longer separated. Diseases of people and animals run amok. Insects and amphibians swarm out of control. What must the numbers have been when every speck of dust in the land became a gnat? Exodus 8:17. What size must the hail have been to shatter every tree? 9:25. And the plagues come to a climax in the darkness, which in effect returns the creation to the first day of Genesis 1, a pre-creation state of affairs. While everything is unnatural in the sense of being beyond the bounds of order created by God, the word hypernatural, nature in excess, may better capture the sense of the natural breaking through its created limits, not functioning as God intended. The plagues are hypernatural at various levels, timing, scope, and intensity. Some sense for this is also seen in the recurrent phrases to the effect that such had never been seen before, nor even shall be again. But these correspondences really serve this purpose, to show that the elements of the natural order are not what they were created to be and to do. Their behaviors break the bounds of their createdness. It is a picture of the creation gone berserk. The world is reverting to a state of chaos. The theological grounding for the plagues is an understanding of the moral order created by God for the sake of justice and well-being in the world. Pharaoh's moral order is bankrupt, severely disrupting this divine intent, and hence he becomes the object of judgment inherent in God's order. God sees to the moral order of things, enabling the effects of Pharaoh's sinfulness. Such judgments are not imposed on the situation from without, but grow out of, have an intrinsic relationship to the sinful or to the good deed. With this framing of issues, Fretheim discusses the correlation between the effects of the plagues as a judgment upon the oppression inflicted upon the Israelites. He writes, correlation between deed and consequence is prominent in these texts. It is sharply evident in Exodus 4:23. The death of the Egyptians, including Pharaoh's firstborn, correlates with that experience of Israel at his hands. Other verbal, thematic correspondences are: 1. The unjust oppression of the Israelites over an extended period of time and a prolonged oppression of the Egyptians by the plagues. 2. The losses experienced by the Israelites' general well-being, property, land, life, and those experienced by the Egyptians. 3. The bondage of Israel and its ill effects on their personhood and the hardening of Egyptians' hearts, 14:17, and the experience of enslavement. The broken spirit, 6:9, of the Israelites that prevents them from hearing the good news finds a correspondence in the hardening of Pharaoh's heart that inhibits his hearing the word of the Lord. 4. The indiscriminate death experienced by Israelite babies at the hands of Pharaoh bent on genocide and the death of the Egyptian firstborn at all levels of society. 5. The cry, se'akah, of the Israelites in bondage, and the cry of Egyptians on the fateful night. 6. The cosmic sphere in which the plagues function correlates directly with the creational sins of Pharaoh, so central in the narrative. Pharaoh has been subverting God's creational work, so the consequences are oppressive, pervasive, public, prolonged, depersonalizing, heartrending, and cosmic, because such has been the effect of Egypt's sin upon Israel, indeed upon the earth, as the pervasive land language suggests. God is certainly portrayed in these texts as active in the interplay of Pharaoh's sins and its consequences, though not without mediation, but in effect God gives Pharaoh up to reap the natural consequences of his anti-creational behaviors. Hardening of the heart, making the heart something other than it was created to be, is another such instance. God seeing to this order is not a passive letting it be, but given the divine faithfulness, God does function within the limits provided by that order. The plagues are thus not an arbitrary, chosen divine response to Pharaoh's sins, as if the vehicle could just as well have been foreign armies or internal revolution. The consequences are cosmic because the sins are creational. God thereby acts to reestablish the rightness of the created order, ironically confessed by Pharaoh himself in 927, saying, "The Lord is in the right," Sadiq. The divine power over all forms of pharaonic power is demonstrated through the moral order for the purpose of recreating justice and righteousness in the world order. The sin-consequence schema is not understood in mechanical terms, however, as if all the results were inevitable and programmed to occur within certain temporal and causal frame. There's a loose causal weave in the moral order. Pharaoh was given an opportunity to break into the schema, to turn the situation around. Note also the warning in 9 verses 19 through 21, where the fear of the word of Yahweh provides relief from judgment, mitigating the effects and sense of the inevitability. God personally enters into the prolongation of the consequences for the public purpose of mission. But, finally, in the face of continuing and resolute refusal, the only way into the future was for God to drive the consequences to their deepest level. It is important to neither minimize the role of Moses in procuring the divine will and overplay the supernatural card, nor simply to offer an explanation in terms of natural causes, and thereby include the divinely providential aspect of the plagues. And so, by doing that, we would overplay the naturalist card. Fretheim also makes astute observations regarding the issue of agency when it comes to God's action, specifically through Moses and/or Aaron. He writes, in terms of agency, God is explicitly active in only 6 plagues. Those of 1, 4, 5, 7, 8, and 10. Aaron and Moses are involved in 3 of these in a dual role, 1, 7, and 8, and alone in plagues 2, 3, 6, and 9. In summary, however, only the agency of Moses is acknowledged, as only God's was in the introduction. In 4 cases where the plague is removed, in plagues 2, 4, 7, and 8, a dual role is again evident as God did according to the word of Moses, see 8:13. In the 8th plague, a 3rd agency, wind, is active in both execution and removal. These complex relationships suggest that while they are God's signs and wonders, one must speak also of the activity of Moses and Aaron with respect to each. Both God and human beings are agents. Moses and Aaron would not be effective without God's power working in and through them, and God is dependent on Moses and Aaron, working in the world through that which is not divine. Both God and Israel recognize this dual agency. Creational theology and the corruption of idolatry. The theology of the Exodus is the lens whereby Israel understands its own creation theology. God is first known to Israel as Redeemer, Deliverer, and only afterward can it receive the revelation of God as Creator. God is known first through God's own initiative to call a people, and then that people comes to understand God as the one who has brought all into being. John Goldingay expresses this truth in these words. So, Israel's story is the foreground against which it understands the world's beginnings. One cannot think about the Creator or creation without regard for that Creator's subsequent acts. God's acting as deliverer enables Israel to understand God's acting as Creator. Conversely, God's acting as Creator enables Israel to understand God's acting as deliverer. And so we see that there is a reciprocal relationship in this formulation. God's initiation of relationship as Savior comes to be enlarged by knowing God as the generous Creator, and vice versa, God as Creator helps to widen the scope of what it means that God is Deliverer. The work of salvation comes to be known as recreation. The creational order of Genesis 1. Along with the Exodus tradition, the creation theology of Israel looms large as a framing landscape upon which the trumpet scenes wreak havoc. The scenes of cosmic catastrophe hang upon the broad tradition of Israel's creation theology in complicated ways. It is a theological precept explicitly endorsed in the previous throne room vision, God created all things. On the other hand, it manifests in the trumpet scenes from the vantage point of the obverse. It is most conspicuous in the condemnation of the corruption in idolatrous worship. Israel's creation traditions were varied. Sometimes the emphasis could be on the divine order that is inherent within the creation, as in Proverbs 8 or Wisdom of Solomon 6 through 10. At other times, the tradition could set the creative work of Yahweh against the backdrop of the cosmic chaos kampf to demonstrate God's sovereign defeat of primal forces of chaos, as in Psalm 89 or Job chapters 38 to 41. At other times, the focus can be on the celebration of God as builder or architect, filling creation with good things. Other narrative construals could emphasize proper order and boundaries, correlating the cultivated land with human and animal obedience. We see that in Genesis chapters 2 through 11. In light of all this rich variation of emphases and themes, it's no wonder that the creation narrative in Genesis 1:1 through 2:3 has such an abundance of interpretive excess. What I mean by this is that this text has a massive range of interpretations throughout the ages, some more compelling than others. When set against the backdrop of other ancient cosmogonies, that is, creation stories, such as those from Egypt or Mesopotamia or Canaanite Phoenician provenance, Genesis 1 takes on a polemical character, challenging the primal violence and the transient nature of the pagan deities. In the cosmogony of Genesis 1, there is a primordial state of darkness and undifferentiated water, but there is no conflict, no battle, no need to vanquish enemies in order to bring forth a functioning cosmos. We read, "In the beginning, when God created the heavens and the earth was a formless void, and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. Then God said," Of the many observations we can make about the creation narrative of Genesis 1, two intersecting observations will serve our purposes. First, the creation narrative of Genesis 1 is a highly structured literary unit which presents the creation in terms of a cosmic temple. Second, within this structure, there is a symmetry that displays a certain creational order with vocational implications for humanity. William Brown has written elegantly on the structural aspects of the text. He notes for Genesis 1:1 through 2:3, the number 7 connotes a ritual sense of completion or fulfillment. It is for this reason, avers Brown, that creation's completion is affirmed on the seventh day, rather than on the sixth. See Genesis 2:2. John Walton is in complete agreement with this proposal, arguing that the ceremony of dedicating or consecrating a temple and its inauguration as a functioning palace for the deity is the conceptual background for the creation narrative in Genesis 1. The temple in the ancient Near East, broadly speaking, functioned as the place in which the deity dwelled and rested. But rested here is not about laying back in a celestial lazy boy and drinking sweet ambrosia tea. Walton explains, the role of the temple in the ancient world is not primarily a place for people to gather in worship like modern churches. It's a place for the deity, sacred space. It is his home, but more importantly, his headquarters, the control room. When the deity rests in the temple, it means he is taking command, that he is mounting his throne to assume his rightful place and his proper role. Walton goes on to explain that temples were associated with cosmic geography. The temple was the axis mundi, the center of the cosmos, and the place from which all other creation was spawned. We can recall the astute description from John Levinson. The temple is not a place in the world, but the world in essence. It is the theology of creation rendered in architecture and glyptic craftsmanship. In the temple, God relates simultaneously to the entire cosmos, for the temple is a microcosm of which the world itself is the macrocosm. Walton expresses a similar sentiment. He writes, indeed, the temple is, for all intents and purposes, the cosmos. The interrelationship makes it possible for the temple to be the center from which order in the cosmos is maintained. In the biblical text, the descriptions of the tabernacle and temple contain many transparent connections to the cosmos. In the outer courtyard were representations of various aspects of cosmic geography. The horizontal axis in the temple was arranged in the same order as the vertical axis in the cosmos. From the courtyard, which contain the elements outside the organized cosmos, cosmic waters and pillars of the earth, one would move into the organized cosmos as he entered the antechamber. Here were the menorah, the table of bread, and the incense altar. As the menorah represented the light provided by God, the bread of the presence represented food provided by God. The altar of incense provided a sweet-smelling cloud across the face of the veil that separated the two chambers. If we transpose the horizontal axis to the vertical, the veil separated the earthly sphere with its functions from the heavenly sphere where God dwells. The latter was represented in the Holy of Holies, where the footstool of the throne of God, the ark, was placed. Thus, the veil served the same function as the firmament. To review then, the courtyard represented the cosmic sphere outside the organized cosmos, sea and pillars. The antechamber held the representations of lights and food. The veil separated the heavens and earth, the place of God's presence, from the place of human habitation. The temple is a microcosm of Eden, and Eden is represented in the antechamber that served as sacred space adjoining the presence of God as an archetypal sanctuary. Now, just as the temple is a microcosm of the entire cosmos, the functioning creation, so then the creation can be viewed as a cosmic temple. Walton writes, Genesis 1 can now be seen as a creation account focusing on the cosmos as a temple. It is describing the creation of the cosmic temple with all of its functions and with God dwelling in its midst. This is what makes day 7 so significant, because without God taking up his dwelling in its midst, the cosmic temple does not exist. The most central truth to the creation account is that this world is a place for God's presence. The establishment of the functional cosmic temple is effectuated by God taking up his residence on day 7. These insights allow us to draw in the second point that is crucial for our study. There is a literary symmetry to the Genesis 1 creation account, which represents the 7 days of creation in particular order that Brown calls, perhaps a bit cheekily, the Genesis Code. What is conveyed by his proposal is that the literary form of the Genesis narrative corresponds to a general tripartite pattern of ancient Near Eastern temple architecture. Brown represents this in a series of diagrams. First, Brown demonstrates how the chronological progression of the Genesis narrative gives rise to a thematic symmetry. In this image, we see that the creation represented on the left side gives form to creation through the establishment of discrete domains, while the column on the right side fills these domains with respective inhabitants. So there is a symmetry between days 1 and 4, between days 2 and 5, and between days 3 and 6. Creation in days 1 through 3 happens through separation and differentiation. Days 4 through 6 establish functionaries to inhabit the spaces which are created. On day 1, God separates the light from the darkness, calling the light period day and the dark period night. Then on day 4, God fills those spaces with the greater light, the sun, and the lesser light, the moon. On day 2, God separates the waters above from the waters below, also creating the space of the sky by holding back the waters above with a firmament. In day 5, God fills those spaces, placing birds in the air, fish in the sea. On day 3, God separates the dry land from the water and places vegetation. Then, on day 6, God creates the cattle, the beasts of the field, all the creepy things. And, finally, God makes humanity in God's own image and establishes humanity as God's own co-regent with the vocation to have dominion and to subdue the earth. In line with the observations from Walton regarding the necessity of the deity to dwell in the temple for it to be a functioning temple, Brown recognizes a key aspect of dissymmetry in day 7. There is no corresponding day, but it stands out by itself. He writes, having no corresponding partner, the 7th day is unique. By its presence, the tight 6-day symmetry of the Genesis account is broken. Nevertheless, this distinctly odd day does establish a vertical correspondence to creation's initial pre-creative condition as described in Genesis 1:2, which one would call, paradoxically, day 0. Thus, Brown offers another diagram to present his findings. He comments on this diagram in the following manner. Together, these 2 days form a surprising correspondence, the static day of non-creation and the theostatic 7th day. The timeless character of day 0 shares a subtle affinity with day 7. The final day lacks the temporal formula, evening came and then morning. It, too, is a day suspended above temporal regularities. Yet these 2 days could not be more different. Day 0 refers to creation's empty formlessness. Day 7 marks creation formed and filled. See Genesis 2:1. The final day serves as the capstone for the entire structure, for it shares something of God's holiness, set apart from creation, yet not set against it. Brown continues his insights by noting how the literary structure of the Genesis narrative corresponds to ancient temple architecture. He explains, without this symmetry-breaking concluding 7th day, the creation pattern would lose a distinction that remains hidden to modern readers not acquainted with the ancient architecture of sacred space. As we know from their remains, many temples of the ancient Near East, particularly in the Syro-Palestinian region, followed a threefold or tripartite structure, a pattern also found, not coincidentally, in the literary symmetry of the Genesis text. This threefold arrangement of sacred space corresponds to the way in which the various days of creation are distributed both chronologically and thematically. The first 6 days, by virtue of their correspondence, establish the architectural boundaries of sacred space. The last day inhabits, as it were, the most holy space. As creation unfolds daily, it becomes constructed in the imago templi, in the model of a temple. What took Solomon 7 years to complete, if we look at 1 Kings 6:38, God took only 7 days, and on a cosmic scale, no less. In the holiest recess of the temple, God dwells, and on the holiest day of the week, God rests. All of these insights will be helpful to understand the background of creational theology that is presupposed by the text of the Apocalypse, as well as the consequence for corrupting and degrading this order by reversing its social and ethical direction in the practice of idolatry. However, before we can consider this, there are some other aspects we need to consider regarding a broader Christian understanding of creation. An astute observer may notice something lacking, or rather something quite conspicuous in the Genesis account of creation. There is not nothing at the beginning of, as Genesis represents it, but rather an undifferentiated mass, the formless and void, and the waters over the face of the deep. See Genesis 1:2. As Bill Arnold observes, Genesis 1 neither precludes nor defends the possibility of creation out of nothing. Gerhard May has famously argued that the doctrine of creatio ex nihilo is entirely absent from the pages of Scripture and is only developed by Christian theologians in the 2nd century to counter Gnostic heresies rooted in Hellenistic metaphysics. However one may evaluate May's historical claims, one can see that the development of the doctrine of creation out of nothing is a logical inference adduced from several tenets which are explicitly conveyed through the Scriptures, both Old and New Testaments. The doctrine of creatio ex nihilo says important things about both God as creator and the character and identity of creation. This is a crucial doctrine for several reasons. One theologian who has initiated a renaissance of reflection on a theology of creation is the late Colin Gunton. Several of his works set up an articulation of a distinct Christian theology of creation as a primary concern. He notes, first of all, that the biblical teaching about the creation presents God as completely free and sovereign. This has a negative and positive expression. In the negative, this means that God did not need to create. There was no lack within the being of God that required God to extend the divine life to something that was not God. The created cosmos and all that is in it. In the positive, this means that God offered to give and share life as pure gift. God created because it delighted God to do so. The words of Jürgen Moltmann are in accord with Gunton's insights and express the doctrine eloquently. He writes, "If God creates heaven and earth, he has then determined that he will be the creator of heaven and earth. Creation is founded on his creative resolve, and his creative resolve touches both God himself and his creation. It is an act of will that is directed both outwards and inwards, whereby the act that is directed inwards objectively precedes the divine act that is turned outwards. Before God creates the world, he determines that he will be the world's creator. This self-designation can be seen from the reflexive structure of the existential resolve of will and personal decision. God commits himself to create a world." God's resolve is an activity or tendency of the divine will in accordance with the nature of God, to do in the course of time that which can and should serve the revelation of God's glory. This shows the goal of the divine resolve. God determines to reveal his own glory. In that glory, his own eternal life and nature are manifested. The creation of the world, different from himself, is the first step towards realizing this eternal resolution to reveal the glory that is the essence of his nature. Consequently, it is the kingdom that determines creation, and creation is the real promise of the kingdom. So although it is certainly true that a revelation of God's will is present in creation first of all, Creation's goal and end is the eschatological revelation of God's nature in glory. Consequently, creation certainly has a beginning, but its consummation in the glory of God has no end. So in this respect, God is not the eternally creative God. He is the God who glorifies himself in both time and eternity. When, finally, we compare the doctrine of decrees and the doctrine of emanation, our purpose should be to find a deeper understanding of the creative God. According to the doctrine of decrees, God's creation is the outcome of his decision. According to the doctrine of emanation, the divine life discloses itself. If the resolve to create is an essential resolve on God's part, we must then say that God discloses himself in the decision he makes. His divine life flows into his resolve, and from that resolve overflows to his creation. Through the resolve, the divine life is communicated to created beings. Through its resolve, the divine life becomes creative, and in its creativity, it is wholly and entirely itself, and is itself wholly and entirely. The unity of will and nature in God can be appropriately grasped through the concept of love. God loves the world with the very same love which he eternally is. Thus, the crucified God, as Moltmann proclaims, is the creator God who has obligated himself to creation in the freedom of divine love to bring creation to culmination in redemptive transformation and a share in the divine life. The next insight Colin Gunton proffers regarding a Christian doctrine of creation considers the manner in which the biblical writers employed a varied but overall consistent pattern of understanding the processes of creation through the mediation of divine action. He explains, with constant reference to Genesis 1, mediation denotes the way we understand one form of action, God's action, to take shape in and in relation to which is not God. The way, that is, by which the actions of one who is creator take form in a world that is of an entirely different order from God because he made it to be so. It is similar to the way in which we understand human actions to take shape in the world. For example, how the intention to make a pot is realized in the relation between the potter's hands and the clay which takes shape through them, or in the way the poet's feeling, ideas, and experience take shape in the words on a page. Again and again, we find Jewish and Christian writers likening God to one who executes his intention by a mere word of command. He spoke it, and it came to be. Think of Genesis 1:3. However, the model of creation by commanding or calling into being by word requires some qualification in Christian theology. This is indeed free and sovereign action, but is in some mysterious way also action that accommodates itself to the nature of that which it brings about. There is greater stress on what we might call the giving of space to be to a reality that is other than God. The world is not simply a function of God's action, though that remains in the center, but that action creates something that has its own unique and particular freedom to be. The point is that the spacious movement of Genesis 1's story of the days of creation indicates that God takes his time in the sense of conforming his action to what he makes, as a great playwright allows a play to conform to the imminent or intrinsic development of character and plot. The pattern of mediation in Genesis enables us to develop a notion of the patient creator who takes his time and so gives the creation its own way of being. The biblical notion of time as that which God gives to things for their own right development is further elaborated in Genesis' depiction of God's resting on the seventh day. This appears to be a naive way of speaking until we realize that it allows the time of creation to point forward to its fulfillment according to the purposes of God. The creation is not a static and timeless lump of matter, but, and we have already compared God to a playwright, something with a direction and destiny. As he continues, Gunton develops a fully Christian Trinitarian theology of the mediation of creation. Following the 2nd century theologian Irenaeus of Lyon, he asserts that the Son and the Spirit are the right and left hand of creation. Gunton writes, the Spirit is shown to be the mediator not only of God's creation, but also of his recreating and transforming action. And of Christ, Gunton writes, it did not take the New Testament writers long to identify God's creating word with Jesus Christ, who is the Word become part of the created order. In the theology of creation, therefore, language of mediation by God's Word enables us to speak both of God's free involvement within His creation and ultimately, in Christ, of His equally free and sovereign identification with a part of it. Simply put, the incarnation of the eternal creating Word in the human being, Jesus of Nazareth, betokens God's freedom of action within the material world, while the Spirit's sovereign action is the mark of God's freedom toward or over against it from the outside, so to speak. With regard to the meaning of creation, Gunton makes the following observations. In accordance with our interpretation of Jewish monotheism in Revelation 4, the first point to note is that the only meaningful distinction between different kinds of being, in technical terms, ontological distinction, is between creator and creation. There are no intermediate forms or that are half divine and half created, or which in some other way fill the intervening space between creator and creature. Two other points go hand in hand. First, rather than being a slight to the world that it is not God or even God-like, quite the reverse is implied. It is no discredit to the world to be worldly, because that is what it is graciously made to be. It is as such, in its own right, that it is good. Everything made by God is good, indeed very good. Think of Genesis 1:31, because it is made through, to, and for Jesus Christ. Think of Colossians 1, verses 15 to 20. His second point. The conception of mediation with which we are working establishes a fundamental unity to the world without prejudice to its variousness and diversity. And finally, a final point can be stated, a final proposition which is really an addition to the second point. The creation was formed in Christ. It is created to be the realm of one who holds it together as a unity. We will have more to say about this Christ-centered aspect of creation below as we discuss the topic of divine providence. The perversion of the creational order, idolatry. All the previous survey demonstrates two things about the biblical tradition of Judeo-Christian creation theology. Everything has been created by God, and everything has a proper role and function in God's creation. There is an order to creation, and humanity has a particular function in that creation. According to Genesis chapter 1, verses 26 through 30, humanity was created in God's own image. There's a long history of reflection on the meaning of this concept, especially in Christian theological tradition. Surprisingly, perhaps, there is less reflection on this theme in the broader Jewish theological tradition, which is rooted in the relative neglect of the concept within the Hebrew Bible after Genesis 5. We should return to the insights of William Brown, considered above. He writes, the cosmic temple code of Genesis 1 also reveals something significant about humanity's role and identity in the creation account. Many an ancient temple contained an image of its resident deity within its inner sanctum. In Jerusalem, however, the physical representation of God was expressly forbidden, conveyed in a certain commandment of the Decalogue, "You shall not make for yourself an idol." Such is what scholars call Israel's aniconic tradition, a categorical prohibition of divine images, which distinguishes ancient Israel's worship practices from some of its more religiously elaborate neighbors. According to biblical lore, the inner sanctum of the Jerusalem temple contained the Ark of the Covenant, covered by the outstretched wings of two cherubim, 1 Kings chapter 6, verses 23 to 28. The ark was regarded as God's footstool or throne, and as the container of the stone tablets of the Decalogue. In place of a statue, the statutes of God were housed. Genesis 1, however, does not jettison the language of divine image, but recasts it by identifying the imago Dei with human beings created on the sixth day. Human beings alone, according to the text, bear an iconic relation to the divine. By virtue of their unique creation, human beings take on the status of near divinity. They bear a distinctly theophanic presence in creation. While God lacks a blatantly anthropomorphic profile in Genesis 1, humanity is unequivocally theomorphic by design. Cast in God's image, women and men reflect and refract God's presence in the world. The only appropriate image of God, according to Genesis, is made of flesh and blood, not wood or gold. There are different meanings attached to the concept of the imago Dei, but in Genesis the focus is on the relationality of humanity, related to God and related to one another, as it says male and female he created them, and humanity's role to serve as God's vice-regent over creation, as it reads, "Let them have dominion," and again, "Be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion." As Joel Green summarizes, Genesis does not define humanity in essentialist terms, but in relational, as Yahweh's partner, and with emphasis on the communal, intersexual character of personhood, the quality of care the human family is to exercise with regard to creation as God's representative, the importance of human modeling of the personal character of God, and the unassailable vocation of humans to reflect among themselves God's own character. Furthermore, Gordon McConville explores the ethical, social, political, and liturgical implications of this portrayal of humanity. He writes, "To put it differently, God-likeness is not a status that has been achieved and now merely needs to be enjoyed. Rather, it commits both God and humans to a life together, the story of which will occupy the pages of the Old Testament and the New. It includes the narratives about worship, in which God chooses to dwell among his people Israel and to seek their love and devotion. And it includes those strands of Old Testament that call the human partner to imitate God in his fundamental orientation toward the world. That is, in his justice and righteousness, faithfulness, holiness, compassion, and truth. Prophets and psalmists both attribute these qualities to God and hold them up as true marks of the life of humans. Humanity both is the image and finds its true self in living in it. Therefore, we can assert that the theological implications of the portrayal of humanity being made in the Imago Dei in Genesis 1 go far beyond simply the utilization of the vocabulary of image. There's a deeper importance for the role of humanity in God's creational order. Humanity bears the vocation of vice-regent over God's creation. Humanity is called to bear the divine rule and lead the rest of creation in the worship of the Creator. That is why the reversal of this order is an act of idolatry, is such an egregious transgression. It reverses the divine order. Idolatry is the original sin of Israel as a newly constituted people, called to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, Exodus 19:6, yet who worship a golden calf as Moses has ascended to Mount Sinai to receive the stipulations of the covenant in Exodus 32-34. Psalm 106 recounts this golden calf incident in such a manner that exhibits the regression of humanity to exchange their glory for the image of an ox. In short, humanity has become like that which they are worshiping. Israel is being formed into the image of its God. Idolatry is a reversal of the creational order and causes an inversion of that order, heading towards non-creation. As the theological tradition develops and expands, the theme of idolatry as original sin becomes the fount of all human rebellion and corruption. In the Wisdom of Solomon, which contrasts righteous Israel, having received the divine Torah, with the wicked Gentiles. In a programmatic statement, wisdom traces all human sin back to idolatry. In contrast with righteous Noah, it begins, "For even in the beginning, when arrogant giants were perishing, the hope of the world took refuge on a raft, and guided by your hand, left to the world the seed of a new generation. For blessed is the wood by which righteousness comes. But the idol made with the hands is accursed, and so is the one who made it. He, for having made it, and the perishable thing, because it was named a god. For equally hateful to God are the ungodly and their ungodliness. For what was done will be punished, together with the one who did it. Therefore, there will be a visitation also upon the heathen idols, because, though part of what God created, they became an abomination, snares for human souls and a trap for the feet of the foolish. For the idea of making idols was the beginning of fornication, and the invention of them was the corruption of life, for they did not exist from the beginning, nor will they last forever. For through human vanity they entered the world, and therefore their speedy end has been planned." The narrative continues through to chapter 16. The motif becomes common in Second Temple Judaism. It's also picked up in the argument of Paul's letter to the Romans, as he demonstrates and expands upon the claim that the wrath of God is revealed against all ungodliness. We will consider this passage further below. Richard Middleton describes the polemical role of Genesis 1 in relation to its ancient Near Eastern context. He writes, "We may take the claim that humanity is created in God's image as constituting an implicit critique of the mediation of the divine through cult images, as practiced, for example, in Mesopotamia. This certainly fits the rhetorical portrayal of creation in Genesis 1 as a cosmic sanctuary, where humanity as imago Dei functions as a parallel to the role of the cult image in the temples of the ancient Near East. Human beings as imago Dei are thus not only priests of the Most High, they are, if we may dare to say it, God's living cult statues on earth. Indeed, humans are the only legitimate or authorized earthly representations of God. Certainly, one important underlying rationale for their prohibition of images is the guarding of God's transcendence by disallowing cultic manipulation. The paradox of idolatry is that the very attempt to control divine presence through images results in the forfeiture of divine presence. Nevertheless, perhaps there is, along with this theological rationale for the prohibition of images, an anthropological rationale as well, concerning the protection of human dignity and agency. If the imago Dei indeed connects royal priestly mediation of the divine presence with the cultural historical agency, perhaps the practice of idolatry goes hand in hand with the forfeiture or diminution of the fundamental human calling to exercise significant power and agency in shaping human culture and civilization. Therefore, in conclusion of this section, we can summarize the points made here. First, we see there is a clear and well-established tradition of a creational order that locates humanity in a pinnacle role as the imago Dei. Second, we see that this vocation establishes an identity for humanity which includes both privileges and responsibilities. Humanity functions as a steward of creation, which is in continued development and in need of maintenance and preservation so that it does not regress back to undifferentiated creation, the formless and void. Finally, humanity, in its commission of idolatrous worship, ignites the fires that lead humanity and all of creation to destructions.